Claude is not always stupid because the model is bad. Sometimes Claude is stupid because you keep handing it a blank room and expecting it to remember where the light switch is. That is what Claude Skills fix. Not in the fluffy productivity sense, in the much more useful sense where Claude stops guessing your repo, stops ignoring your tests, stops inventing your style, and stops giving you that beautiful, confident answer that falls apart the second you run it. Skills are one of those features that sound tiny until you realize what they actually change. They let you turn the instructions you keep repeating into reusable behavior. Read the repo this way, review the diff this way, run the checks this way, write the handoff this way. Do not touch these files. Do not pretend the test passed. Do not explain for 8 paragraphs when the user needs the command. That is the real use case. Claude skills are not there to make Claude more magical. They are there to make Claude less weird. And if you use the wrong skills, they become another pile of prompt sludge. But if you use the right ones, Claude starts acting less like a very smart intern on day one and more like a teammate who has been corrected the same way 100 times and finally learned. So I'm going to be opinionated. There are 5 skills I think are actually worth building first. Not 10, not a giant marketplace, binge 5. Because the goal is not to give Claude more toys. The goal is to stop it doing the dumb stuff that costs you time. Hey, don't forget to like and subscribe for more like this. Now back to the video. The first thing to understand is that a Claude skill is not just a longer prompt. That is the boring definition, and it misses the point. A skill is a folder with a skill.md file inside it. That file describes when Claude should use the skill and what Claude should do when the skill is active. It can also sit next to scripts, templates, examples, checklists, and reference files. Claude does not need to read all of that all the time. That is why skills matter. They use progressive disclosure. Claude sees the short descriptions of available skills, then loads the relevant one when the job actually needs it. That sounds like a small context trick. It is not. It changes the way you should design your AI workflow. Most people put everything into one giant claude.md file, repo rules, style rules, test commands, deployment steps, architecture notes, naming preferences, warnings, pet peeves. The problem is that Claude now has to carry all of that through every task, even when most of it is irrelevant. You ask it to fix a button color, and it is dragging the production release checklist behind it. You ask it to summarize a diff, and it is still staring at the database migration policy. That is not discipline, that is baggage. Skills let you split the behavior by job. One skill for finding the right files, one skill for making a safe change, one skill for test failures, one skill for review, one skill for final delivery. Now, Claude does not need one giant memory dump. It needs the right procedure at the right time. That is the whole angle. Claude is already smart enough to write code. The failure is usually that it does not know what kind of work it is doing. So it improvises, and agent improvisation is where your afternoon goes to die. The first skill I would build is a repo map skill. This is the one that stops Claude from opening random files like it is searching a haunted attic. Every code base has a shape. There is an app entry point, there are routes, there are tests, there are shared utilities. There's probably one directory that looks important but is actually old. There's probably one generated folder. Claude should never edit. And there are usually 3 files that explain the whole project faster than 50,000 tokens of wandering. A repo map skill tells Claude how to orient itself before it changes anything. Not a generic command like read the repo that is too vague. A useful repo map skill says something sharper. Start by listing the files that define the app structure, find the package manager, find the test command, find the build command, find the main feature directories, find existing examples before inventing a new pattern, summarize only the files that affect this task. Then make a small plan. This skill is boring, that is why it works. The dumbest Claude mistakes often happen before code is written. It patches the wrong layer, it uses a helper that does not exist. It creates a new abstraction when the repo already has one. It edits the generated file instead of the source file. It assumes React when the app is using something else. It assumes npm when the repo uses pnpm. It assumes the old folder is active because the name looks official. That is not a reasoning failure. That is a navigation failure, and navigation failures are exactly what skills are good at. You do not need Claude to be a genius for this part. You need it to check the map before it drives. The repo map skill should be short, strict, and annoying in the best way. It should force Claude to find evidence before touching code. If the task is small, it should keep the map small. If the task is risky, it should widen the map. And most importantly, it should end with the actual files Claude thinks it needs. That one habit alone can save you from a huge amount of AI nonsense. Because once Claude names the files, you can see whether it understands the job. If it names the wrong files, you stop it early. That is how you stop stupid. Not by yelling a better prompt, by making the first move observable. The second skill is the change contract skill. This one is more important than people think. Claude is very good at expanding the task. You ask for a small bug fix, it also reformats the file, then it renames a helper, then it updates a dependency, then it changes a test style, then it proudly says the implementation is cleaner. That word cleaner has destroyed a lot of afternoons. A change contract skill tells Claude what kind of change is allowed before it starts. The key is not to make it timid, the key is to make it bounded. For a bug fix, the contract might say change the minimum number of files, preserve public behavior except the bug, add or update the closest test, and do not refactor unrelated code. For a feature, it might say use existing patterns, avoid new dependencies unless necessary, include loading and error states, and make the smallest complete version. For a cleanup task, it might say do not change behavior, prove equivalence with tests, and call out anything you intentionally left alone. This skill stops one of the most expensive agent habits. The agent starts solving the version of the task it prefers, not the version you asked for. Claude does this because it is trying to be helpful. It sees a messy area and wants to improve it. It sees duplication and wants to remove it. It sees a name and wants to rename it. It sees a boring fix and wants to produce something more impressive. That instinct is poison when the job is narrow, so the change contract skill gives Claude a lane. It says, before editing, classify the job, bug fix, feature, refactor, investigation, documentation, then follow the matching rules. This is where skills beat normal prompting. You do not want to paste that whole decision tree every time. You also do not want it in every conversation forever. You want Claude to pull it in when the work involves a code change. That is exactly the size of problem skills are built for. And there is a small psychological trick here. When Claude has to state the contract first, it becomes easier to catch drift later. If it said this is a narrow bug fix and then it touches 12 files, the mistake is obvious. If it said no new dependency and then adds one, the mistake is obvious. If it said preserve public behavior and then changes the API shape, the mistake is obvious. The contract turns vague quality into something checkable. That is what makes Claude less stupid, not vibes, boundaries. The third skill is a test failure skill. This is a skill I think almost every coding agent needs because Claude has a very specific kind of stupidity around failing tests. It sees a red error and immediately wants to edit code. Sometimes that is right. Very often it is not. The test could be stale, the setup could be wrong, the command could be missing an environment variable, the failure could be caused by a previous edit, the failure could be one snapshot hiding 5 real errors behind it, the failure could be in a package Claude never touched. And if Claude jumps straight to code, it can make the problem worse while sounding extremely productive. A good test failure skill forces a loop. First, identify the command that failed. Second, quote the smallest useful part of the error. Third, name the likely layer. Fourth, inspect the related test and implementation. Fifth, change one thing. Sixth, rerun the narrowest check. Seventh, only widen the check after the narrow one passes. That is it. That tiny loop is more valuable than a huge amount of clever prompting, because failing tests punish imagination, they reward evidence. Claude needs to be forced into evidence mode. The skill should also include one brutal rule. Never claim a test passed unless the output says it passed. That sounds obvious.
Yeah.
It is apparently not obvious enough. AI coding tools love saying things like, this should now pass. That sentence is not a result, it is a wish wearing a lab coat. The skill should make Claude separate 3 things: what was run, what passed, what still failed. If nothing was run, say nothing was run. That single behavior changes the trust level of the whole agent, because the worst Claude output is not wrong code. Wrong code can be fixed, the worst output is fake certainty. The test failure skill attacks fake certainty directly. It makes Claude show its work where the work actually matters, and it prevents the classic spiral. Patch fail, patch somewhere else, fail differently, patch the test, fail silently, declare a victory. No, the skill says slow down, isolate, prove, then move. That is not glamorous, that is professional. The fourth skill is the code review skill, but I do not mean a generic review prompt. Generic review prompts are mostly theater. Review this for bugs, security, performance, and readability. That sounds responsible. It also gives Claude 4 giant buckets and no priorities, so it writes a polite list of maybe issues. The useful version is a review skill that knows what you actually care about. For most developers, I would make it brutally practical. Review the diff, prioritize real bugs over style. Look for missing error paths. Look for state that can get out of sync. Look for unsafe assumptions about null values, empty arrays, permissions, time zones, file paths, or retries. Check whether tests cover the changed behavior. Ignore cosmetic preferences unless they hide a bug. Give file and line references. Do not congratulate the code. Do not pad the answer. If there are no issues, say that this is the skill that stops Claude being too nice, and Claude being too nice is a real problem. When you ask an AI to review code, it often behaves like it is reviewing a coworker in a meeting. Soft language, Balanced feedback, lots of hedging, maybe consider could potentially might be worth. That is not what you need. You need a bug detector. You need it to be comfortable saying, this line breaks when the list is empty. You need it to say, this permission check moved after the data fetch. You need it to say, this retries forever. You need it to say, the test only checks the happy path, and you need it to stop after the useful findings. This is why a skill is better than asking Claude to be a senior reviewer every time. Senior reviewer is a personality costume. A good skill is a checklist with teeth. It tells Claude what counts as a finding. It tells Claude what does not count. It tells Claude how to order the response. And it tells Claude to keep summaries short because the findings are the product. That last part matters. A review that hides the bug under 3 paragraphs of friendliness is a bad review. The skill should make the output sharp. Severity first. Evidence next. Residual risk last. No filler. That is how you turn Claude from a reassuring autocomplete into something closer to a useful second pair of eyes. The 5th skill is the final answer skill. This sounds almost too small to include. It is not a huge amount of AI frustration happens after the work is technically done. Claude makes the change. Then it writes a final answer that is either too vague, too long, too confident, or missing the one thing you actually needed. It says, implemented the requested changes. What changes where? Did the test run? Did anything fail? Is there a follow-up? Can I trust this? A final answer skill fixes that. It tells Claude exactly how to close the task. Name the files changed, explain the behavior change in plain language, state what was verified, state what was not verified. Mention any known risk, keep it short. Do not dump the whole process. Do not tell the user to copy files they already have. Do not pretend a command ran if it did not. This skill matters because the final answer is the receipt. It is where the human decides whether the agent is done, whether to test it, whether to commit it, or whether to keep investigating. If that answer is mush, the whole task feels mushy, and this is where Claude can be weirdly bad. It either undersells the important part or oversells the whole thing. It says everything is ready when there is no verification, or it gives a giant essay when the user just needs the practical state of the work. The final answer skill makes completion honest. That sounds basic, but honest completion is one of the biggest differences between a toy agent and a useful agent. A useful agent can say, I changed this, I checked this, I could not check that. That is a much better ending than a confident fog machine. Now here's the trap. Most people will use skills wrong. They will create one giant super skill called something like Ultimate Developer Brain. They will put every preference inside it. They will paste in long documents. They will add examples, policies, architecture notes, commands, style guides, forbidden words, deployment instructions, and 10 different workflows. Then they will wonder why Claude still behaves strangely. That is not a skill. That is a junk drawer with Markdown. The best skills are small enough that you can tell when they work. Repo map worked if Claude found the right files before editing. Change contract worked if Claude stayed inside the task. Test failure worked if Claude isolated the error instead of flailing. Code review worked if it found real risks and skipped fake wisdom. Final answer worked if you know exactly what changed and what was verified. That is the standard. If you cannot tell whether a skill improved behavior, the skill is probably too vague. A bad skill says, be careful. A good skill says, before editing, identify the active package manager and the closest existing pattern. A bad skill says, write good code. A good skill says, do not add a dependency unless the repo already uses it or the user approves it. A bad skill says, review thoroughly. A good skill says, findings first, only real bugs. Cite files and lines, no praise. Specific beats inspirational every time. And there's another trap. Do not put stable facts and active procedures in the same place. Facts are things Claude may need to know. Procedures are things Claude needs to do. The repo uses PNPM is a fact. Before fixing a test failure, rerun the narrowest test first is a procedure. Skills are strongest when they are procedures. They are repeatable little workflows that pull Claude into the correct mode. If the skill is just a pile of knowledge, it may still help, but the real magic is behavioral. You're training the process around the model, not the model itself. So what would I actually create first? I would not start with a documentation skill. I would not start with a meeting summary skill. I would not start with a giant architecture expert skill. I would start with the places Claude embarrasses itself most often. Number 1, repo map. Stop it getting lost. Number 2, change contract. Stop it expanding the task. Number 3, test failure. Stop it guessing after read output. Number 4, code review. Stop it being politely useless. Number 5, final answer. Stop it ending with mush. Those 5 skills cover the whole shape of a coding task. Orient, bound, fix, check, report. That is the agent loop you actually want. And the reason this matters is that coding agents are becoming less about raw model intelligence and more about harness quality. The model is one part. The loop around it is the other part. Tools matter, permissions matter, context matters, checks matter, and now skills matter because they give you a way to package the habits that make the agent tolerable. This is why I think Claude skills are underrated, not because they make Claude smarter in some mystical way, because they make the dumb parts repeatably less dumb. They remove the repeated lecture, they reduce the giant prompt, they make the workflow portable, they let you build small procedures that Claude can load only when needed, and they give teams a way to stop relying on one person remembering to paste a sacred paragraph into chat. That is a serious upgrade, but I would be careful about skills marketplaces. Not because marketplaces are bad, they can be useful. Claude Code can install plugins from marketplaces, and plugins can include skills, agents, hooks, and other capabilities. That is powerful. But the most valuable skills are usually not generic. They are specific to your repo, your team, your tests, your release habits, and your definition of done. A generic skill can teach Claude a common workflow. Your project skill can stop Claude from breaking your actual app. Those are different levels of value, so my rule would be simple. Install generic skills for formats and common tasks. Create your own skills for behavior that keeps going wrong in your project. If Claude keeps making the same mistake twice, that is not just a prompt problem anymore. That is a skill candidate. If you keep typing the same correction, that is a skill candidate. If every new chat needs the same warning, that is a skill candidate. If your team has an unwritten rule that only one person remembers, that is absolutely a skill candidate. The best skills come from irritation. They are little scars from real agent failures. Claude edited the generated file once. Now there is a skill that says never do that. Claude skipped the test command once. Now there is a skill that makes verification explicit. Claude wrote a 12-paragraph final answer once. Now there is a skill that keeps the closeout tight. This is how you should think about it. Do not build skills because the feature exists. Build skills because Claude annoyed you in a repeatable way. That is the signal. The bigger story is that AI coding is moving from prompts to operating procedures. That is why skills feel small but matter so much. The early version of AI coding was basically ask the model nicely. Then people discovered prompt files, then context files, then tools, then MCP, then hooks, then sub-agents. Now skills sit in this interesting middle layer. They are not tools, they are not memory, they're not just slash commands, they are reusable instructions with optional resources loaded when the task calls for them. That means they can become the missing layer between human preference and agent behavior. Not perfect, not automatic magic, but practical. And practical is what most developers actually need. You do not need Claude to recite your entire engineering philosophy. You need it to stop making the same 5 mistakes. You need it to find the right files. You need it to stay in scope. You need it to treat failing tests as evidence. You need it to review for real bugs. You need it to tell you honestly what happened. That is it. If Claude does those 5 things, it suddenly feels much less stupid. Not because the model changed, because the work changed around it. And that is the uncomfortable lesson. Some of the intelligence you want from AI coding is not inside the model. It is in the process you force the model to follow. Claude skills give you a clean way to package that process. So no, I would not treat skills like collectible power-ups. I would treat them like seatbelts, small, boring, annoying when you forget them, very useful the moment something goes wrong. The developers who get the most out of Claude skills will not be the ones with the biggest skill folder. They will be the ones with the sharpest few skills. The ones that encode real mistakes, the ones that make the agent prove what it is doing, the ones that turn repeated frustration into a repeatable workflow. That is the whole point. Claude does not need more personality, it needs better habits, and skills are one of the cleanest ways to give it those habits without pasting the same lecture into every chat forever.